The ballroom was awash in gold and glass, cameras flashing like lightning against the mirrored walls of the Hale Foundation gala. Arthur Hale stood at the podium, the image of precision. Tailored suit, calm voice, every word rehearsed to perfection, until her laugh, soft, fleeting, cut through the noise. Across the glittering expanse, Ruth Ainsley stood frozen, framed beneath a chandelier's fractured light. Her crimson dress trembled with each shaky breath. On either side of her were two children, one tugging curiously at her hand, the other watching Arthur with eyes the same storm-gray shade as his own. The world seemed to tilt. Conversations fell away. Arthur stepped down from the stage, each stride deliberate, every muscle strung tight with disbelief. The crowd parted, the cameras followed, and by the time he stopped in front of her, even the orchestra had gone silent. "You have some explaining to do, Ruth," he said, voice low enough to carry and sharp enough to break her heart all over again. Ruth's throat constricted. The twins pressed closer to her sides. 6 years of silence and every secret she'd buried hovered between them like smoke. The room spun with whispers. She met his gaze one last time and whispered, "Not here." Arthur's reply was barely audible, a promise and a warning all at once. "You don't get to disappear twice." And as the flashbulbs erupted and the world watched a billionaire unravel, the story rewinds. To the night, everything began. "Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. I've missed you all so much. It's been a tough ride with some technical issues, but by God's grace, we're getting everything back on track. Thank you for sticking with me. Your support means everything. Before we begin, I want to say a little prayer over everyone watching, especially the women. To the women, may God strengthen you, comfort you, and fill your heart with peace and favor. To the men, may God guide you, bless your efforts, and give you wisdom in all you do, and may God's protection rest on every single one of you. Amen. If you're ready for today's story, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. My USA and UK family, I see you. And please watch till the end, because tomorrow I'll be dropping another story you wouldn't want to miss. Now, let's get into the story. 6 years earlier, before the gala, before the twins, before the world reminded them who they were, there was only a storm, a crash, and a woman who refused to let him die. The first scream of metal split the night. Arthur Hale barely had time to look up from the glowing tablet on his lap before the cabin tilted at an impossible angle. The lights flickered, then died, plunging the jet into darkness. "Sir, we've lost the left engine," the pilot shouted, voice crackling through the intercom. Arthur's glass of bourbon slid from the table, shattering at his feet. He braced against the leather seat as the world outside dissolved into lightning and rain. "Mayday! Mayday!" the radio shrieked, cut off by static. Arthur felt the drop before he understood it, the gut-wrenching free fall, the violent lurch of gravity tearing the plane from the sky. His body slammed against the seatbelt. A blinding flash filled the window. Then nothing but sound, the roar of wind, the crash of trees, the sickening crunch of metal and earth. Silence followed, the kind that swallows everything. When he opened his eyes, smoke filled the cabin. The scent of fuel burned his throat. His right arm screamed with pain, blood soaking the sleeve of his tailored suit. For once in his life, Arthur Hale had no control. The storm had been building for hours, turning the back roads of Addison County into rivers of mud. Ruth Ainsley gripped the steering wheel of her ambulance, her eyelids heavy with exhaustion. "Last call," she muttered to herself, half prayer, half promise. It was supposed to be her night off. Instead, she'd been covering for a sick co-worker, 3 emergency runs in 12 hours, 2 car crashes and a heart attack. Her scrubs were stiff with dried blood and rain. She glanced at the photo taped to the dash. Her mother, smiling weakly in a hospital bed, hand raised in a wave. "Hang in there, Mom," Ruth whispered. The radio crackled. Static first, then a strained voice. "Dispatch to all units. Possible aircraft down. Coordinates north of Route 19. Smoke visible from the tree line. Approach with caution." Ruth exhaled, long and slow. Her partner groaned from the passenger seat. "You've got to be kidding me. We're not even close to that sector." "Closest responder wins," she said, flipping the siren switch. The red lights sliced through the rain. "Ruth, you've been up 36 hours. "I'm awake," she cut in. "Let's go." It took 20 minutes to find the wreckage. The trees were snapped in half like matchsticks, smoke curling into the downpour. Ruth parked the ambulance on the dirt road, grabbed her kit, and ran. "Stay with the rig," she shouted over her shoulder. The air reeked of fuel and ozone. Through the smoke, she saw the silver tail of a private jet, twisted against the forest floor. Her boots sank into mud as she climbed through debris. "Hello? Can anyone hear me?" A faint groan answered. She followed it, past a shredded seat, a briefcase, a torn designer jacket. Her flashlight beam landed on a man half buried under a section of fuselage. "Sir, can you hear me?" He stirred, coughing, trying to sit up. Blood streaked his temple. His right arm hung at an unnatural angle. Ruth dropped to her knees, forcing calm into her voice. "Don't move. You've been in a crash." His eyelids fluttered open, steel-gray eyes, dazed, defiant. "Where's the pilot?" His voice was rough but commanding. She checked quickly. No pulse at the cockpit. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "You're the only survivor." His jaw clenched. He looked away. Ruth leaned closer, assessing his wounds. "You've got a laceration on your head, possibly a dislocated shoulder, and just get me out of here." The tone was clipped, almost imperious, as if he were giving an order in a boardroom rather than bleeding in the woods. Ruth bit back a retort. "That's what I'm doing. Try not to die while I do it." Despite the pain, the corner of his mouth twitched, half a grimace, half a smirk. It took everything she had to drag him clear. Rain soaked through her jacket. Her hands were slick with blood and mud. Lightning lit the clearing, and for a second she saw his face clearly. Handsome, angular, too well groomed for the wilderness. Definitely not a local, she thought. The storm intensified, wind howling through the trees. Her radio sputtered, useless. "The roads are washed out," she muttered. "We'll never make it back to town tonight." "Then what's your plan, paramedic?" he asked through clenched teeth. She pointed uphill. "There's a ranger cabin about half a mile from here. If we can make it there, I can stabilize you until morning." He exhaled, short and sharp. "You're in charge, then?" "Damn right I am," she said. By the time they reached it, Ruth's muscles were trembling from exertion. The cabin was old, half swallowed by the forest, but the door gave way under her shoulder. Inside, dust, cobwebs, the faint scent of pine. A small stove in the corner, a single bed, and a table with a cracked lantern. Ruth guided him to the bed, lowering him carefully. He gritted his teeth as his shoulder jostled. "Name?" she asked, pulling out her trauma kit. "Arthur." "Last name?" He hesitated. "Hale." She didn't react. She didn't have the energy to recognize that name, or to care that it belonged to one of the richest men on the planet. She tore open a sterile pad and began cleaning his wounds. He hissed when the antiseptic hit his skin. "You're enjoying this," he muttered. "Immensely," she said, deadpan. "Hold still." Her hands were efficient, steady. She cut away his blood-soaked sleeve, revealing a deep gash along his forearm. "Good news. You'll live. Bad news. This is going to hurt like hell." She set his shoulder with a swift, practiced motion. He swore violently, the sound echoing in the small cabin. "See," she said, reaching for the bandages. "Told you." He gave her a sharp look. "You don't talk to people like me that way." "Lucky for you, I don't know who people like you are." That earned her silence, and something else. Interest. For a while, the only sound was rain drumming against the roof. Ruth cleaned the last of the blood from his temple, noticing the faint tremor in her hands now that the adrenaline had faded. "You should rest," she said softly. He didn't. His gaze followed her as she packed away her supplies. "You're not from here, are you?" "I grew up 2 towns over." "Why?" "You don't talk like the others," she raised an eyebrow. "You've met a lot of Vermont paramedics, have you?" That smirk again. Barely there. "No, but I've met a lot of people who hide behind politeness." Ruth pulled a blanket over him. "You're bleeding, not philosophizing. Sleep." But his eyes didn't close. They were sharp now, assessing her like she was an equation he couldn't solve. "Why'd you come out here?" he asked. Most people would have waited for backup. "Because you would have been dead by the time backup arrived." "You didn't even know who I was," she shrugged. "Didn't matter." That answer seemed to catch him off guard. He studied her face as though searching for proof she meant it. Finally, he said quietly, "No one's said that to me in years." Ruth didn't know what to do with that. So she turned away, busying herself with the lantern, her pulse suddenly loud in her ears. The storm raged for hours. Ruth managed to coax a small fire to life in the stove. The warmth filled the cabin, chasing shadows from the corners. Arthur stirred on the bed, half awake. "You should rest too," he murmured. "I will." But she didn't. She sat near the fire, staring into the flames, exhaustion pressing against her ribs. He watched her through half-lidded eyes. Without the sharpness of pain, her face softened, freckles faint against her damp skin, curls pulled into a messy bun, eyes ringed with fatigue. She looked like someone who'd seen too much of the world, but refused to give up on it. He didn't remember falling asleep. When Ruth woke, the storm had eased to a soft drizzle. Dawn light filtered through the cracked window. Arthur was awake, sitting up, inspecting the sling she'd made for his arm. "How's the pain?" she asked. "Manageable," he said, though the wince betrayed him. "You're good at this." "I should be," she replied, packing her kit. "Been doing it for 8 years." He watched her tie her boots, his expression unreadable. "Why'd you become a paramedic?" Ruth glanced at him. "Because someone has to show up." He seemed to weigh that answer, then said, "People like you. You don't last long around people like me." "People like you?" she repeated. He hesitated, then offered a faint smile. "Rich, complicated, usually impossible." Ruth chuckled under her breath. "You're definitely the last two." The sound made him pause, a real laugh, short and surprised. It was the first warmth between them. By mid-morning, the rain had stopped. Smoke still rose faintly from the crash site below. Ruth tried her radio again. This time, it crackled to life. "Dispatch, this is Unit 9. I have one survivor from the aircraft. Male, mid-30s, stable condition, requesting evac coordinates." Relief washed through her. Arthur pushed himself upright, wincing. "You'll be famous for this, you know." "I'm not interested in fame." "Then what are you interested in?" Ruth hesitated. Getting people home alive. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, two strangers bound by an accident. Neither had chosen. "Thank you," he said finally, voice low, sincere. She nodded. "Just doing my job." But when she turned to check the window, he was still watching her, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. Outside, the rescue chopper approached, blades slicing through the mist. Ruth stepped aside as they loaded him onto the stretcher. He caught her hand before she could move away. If there's anything I can ever do to repay you." "You already did," she said. "You lived." He opened his mouth to protest, but the medics pushed the stretcher toward the door. She watched him go. The storm-washed forest stretching endlessly around them. In a few hours, she'd be back on shift. Another call. Another life to save. She didn't know that this man, the arrogant, wounded stranger she'd dragged from the wreckage, would soon change hers forever. That one night, born from chaos, would echo for years. The rain hadn't stopped. By the time the sun slipped behind the gray horizon, the forest had dissolved into mist and thunder again. The rescue chopper never came. Static hissed endlessly through the radio, every attempt at communication swallowed by the storm. Ruth clicked the receiver off and leaned against the wall of the ranger cabin, exhaustion creeping into her bones. "Well," she muttered, "looks like it's just you and me for the night, Mr. Crash Survivor." Arthur sat on the narrow cot, his injured arm secured in the makeshift sling she'd fashioned from an old towel. The firelight painted his face in sharp gold and shadow. He gave a wry, almost imperceptible smile. "Arthur," he corrected softly. "Fine," she said, unwrapping a protein bar from her medical pack. "Arthur, you hungry?" "I've eaten worse things in the desert," he murmured, taking the half she offered. "Desert?" He smirked faintly. "Long story, different crash." Ruth arched a brow but didn't press. She sat opposite him by the fire, stretching her sore legs. Outside, thunder rolled like a living thing. For a while, neither spoke, just the steady patter of rain and the slow crackle of wood. Then Ruth's gaze fell to his wrist. The light caught on a watch, sleek, silver, expensive. The engraving along the inside edge caught her eye. Arthur Hale, Hale Dynamics. Her eyebrows lifted. "Wait a second," she said slowly. "You're Arthur Hale." He looked up, wary. "You've heard the name?" "Hard not to," she replied, folding her arms. "Every article about billionaires reinventing the future has your face on it." He gave a tired, self-deprecating laugh. "Ah, my legacy, clickbait headlines and shareholder panic. So, Mr. Fancy Plane really is fancy," she teased, nodding toward him. "Good to know I didn't just save an average egomaniac." His eyes flashed with surprise and something like amusement. "You're not intimidated?" "By what?" she said, shrugging. "Money? Power? Those things don't mean much in a thunderstorm." Arthur tilted his head, studying her like she'd just rewritten a law of physics. "You're a strange woman, Ruth Ainsley." "Yeah," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I get that a lot." The fire popped. Outside, the wind howled against the cabin's thin walls. Ruth leaned back, her voice quieter now. "You ever notice storms make people talk, like confession booths with lightning?" Arthur's expression shifted, guarded, then thoughtful. "Maybe because storms remind us we're not in control." "That's not a feeling you're used to, is it?" she asked gently. He looked at her then, not like a man used to being challenged, but like someone startled by honesty. "No," he admitted. "Control is what I'm built on. My company. My life. Everything I am depends on keeping the chaos in check." "And tonight?" "Tonight the chaos won," he said simply. Ruth nodded. She understood that feeling too well. When she didn't respond, he asked, "What about you? Why put yourself in danger for strangers?" Ruth let out a soft laugh. "Because someone has to, and because it distracts me from the parts of my life I can't fix." "Like what?" She hesitated, fingers tracing the edge of her medical kit. "My mom's sick. Early onset dementia. I take care of her when I'm not working." Arthur's gaze softened. "That's a lot for one person." "Yeah," she said quietly. "It is. But she raised me alone after my dad died, so it feels like my turn." She rubbed the bridge of her nose, embarrassed she'd said so much. Sorry. Long night. Oversharing. He shook his head. Don't apologize. I don't remember the last time someone talked to me like that. Like what? Like I was just a man, not a headline. Ruth smiled faintly. You make it sound like that's rare. It is, he said. You spend enough years being Arthur Hale, visionary of Hale Dynamics, and eventually you forget what it's like to be just Arthur. She considered him for a moment, the rigid shoulders, the perfectly tailored arrogance cracked open by pain and exhaustion. Maybe the world needs both, she said softly. Arthur Hale, the visionary, and Arthur, the guy who bleeds like everyone else. He huffed a quiet laugh. Bleeds, swears, and apparently passes out in the woods. Progress, she teased. The hours stretched. The storm outside refused to fade, as though it wanted to trap them together. Ruth sat closer to the fire, rubbing her hands for warmth. Arthur watched her, his voice low. You're freezing. I'm fine. You've been awake almost 2 days, he said. You should rest. I can't, she replied. If the bleeding starts again, I need to keep an eye on you. He smiled, barely there, but genuine. You really don't quit, do you? Not until the job's done. He looked at her like that answer was something sacred. Tell me something, she said after a pause. If you weren't building tech empires and terrifying your board of directors, what would you be doing? Arthur stared into the fire for a long time. Honestly, I don't know. My father raised me to believe success was the only language worth speaking. He didn't think much of me when I started Hale Dynamics. Called it a vanity project. Her brow furrowed. Guess you proved him wrong? Yeah, he said softly, but proving him wrong didn't feel like winning. It just made the silence louder. The confession hung in the air between them, fragile as glass. Ruth watched him, realizing the man everyone saw, the billionaire, the icon, wasn't sitting in front of her. This one was raw and tired and human. You know, she said gently, you talk about control like it's armor. But armor's heavy, Arthur. Eventually you forget how to move without it. He turned toward her, eyes steady. And what would you know about armor? She smiled, small and sad. Mine looks different. It's work, long shifts, no sleep, no time to think about what I've lost. They sat in silence again, two people stripped bare by the storm. Lightning flashed through the window, illuminating his face for a heartbeat. Then darkness swallowed the room as the last bit of electricity flickered and died. Ruth reached for the lantern. Great, she muttered. Now we're officially stranded. Arthur's voice came from the shadows, warm and low. Maybe that's not the worst thing. She froze. Excuse me? I mean, he said quietly, maybe it's not so bad to stop running the world for one night. She found him by the faint glow of the fire. His expression wasn't smug. It was open, unguarded in a way that startled her. Ruth, he murmured, for one night, let's just be two people who don't owe the world anything. The rain softened outside, a steady rhythm against the roof. She met his gaze and, for the first time, didn't look away. The storm wouldn't quit. Hours passed, but the rain still lashed the cabin in relentless waves. The wind howled through the eaves like a wounded animal. Inside, the air glowed with the low orange hum of dying embers, and something warmer, an unspoken understanding that had taken root between them. Arthur Hale sat at the edge of the cot, his bandaged arm resting against his thigh, watching Ruth move about the small cabin. She was quiet, methodical, and achingly human, wringing water from her soaked jacket, checking his temperature, restocking her kit. Every gesture was simple, but it steadied him in ways he couldn't name. He wasn't used to this. Being tended to. Being seen. Do you ever stop? he asked finally, breaking the silence. Ruth turned. Her curls framed her face, wild from the humidity. Stop what? Fixing everything. She laughed softly, almost bitterly. If I stopped fixing things, people would die. Maybe, he said. Or maybe someone else would step up for once. She glanced at him, then away, uncomfortable with the weight of his gaze. You say that like you've tried it. I've tried everything, he murmured, staring into the fire. Except letting go. Her expression softened. Maybe that's your problem. He looked at her then, really looked, at the exhaustion etched into her face, at the stubborn determination that refused to fade. And yours is that you never let anyone catch you, he said. Ruth hesitated, heart skipping. What makes you think I need catching? Arthur's lips curved faintly. Because I recognize the look. It's the same one I see in the mirror every morning. She joined him by the fire again, sitting cross-legged on the floor. The storm outside pulsed like a heartbeat, steady and furious. Tell me something true, he said quietly, something no one else knows. Ruth exhaled, leaning her head back against the wall. Something true? Okay. I hate the sound of sirens. He raised a brow. You're a paramedic. Exactly, she said with a small, rueful smile. You'd think I'd be used to it. But every time I hear them, my stomach twists, because I know someone's about to have the worst day of their life, and I have to show up pretending I can fix it. She traced patterns in the dust beside her. Sometimes I wish I could just disappear. Go somewhere quiet, paint, sleep, not worry that someone's heart is about to stop beating. Arthur watched her, his expression unreadable. You paint? Used to, before life got complicated. He nodded, thoughtful. My mother used to paint, he said after a pause. Before she married my father. What happened? She married my father, he said simply, and she laughed, though there was no humor in it. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He had this way of making her feel like her art was childish, unproductive. By the time I was 10, every canvas in the house was gone. She died not long after. I think she just ran out of color. Ruth's chest tightened. Arthur, I'm sorry. He shrugged, but there was no real indifference in it. I built Hale Dynamics to prove he was wrong about me. And I did. But sometimes I wonder if I lost something else in the process. Like what? He looked at her with an expression that almost broke her. Like the part of me that knows how to feel without measuring the cost. They sat in silence for a long time. The fire crackled softly, and the storm outside seemed to listen. Tell me about your father, he said eventually. Ruth smiled faintly, though her eyes were sad. He was a mechanic, quiet, the kind of man who could fix anything, except the things that mattered most. Sounds familiar, Arthur said softly. He used to tell me, Ruth continued, if you can't save the world, at least save one person. I guess I took that literally. And who saves you? She blinked, startled by the question. He leaned closer, voice low. When you're the one who fixes everyone else, who fixes you? Her throat tightened. No one. That's not how it works. It could be, he said. Something in his tone, something warm and unguarded, made her chest ache. She turned to look at him. The firelight played over his features, softening the sharpness of his jaw, revealing the exhaustion beneath his composure. For the first time since she'd found him in the wreckage, he didn't look like a billionaire. He just looked like a man. And she didn't feel like a savior anymore, just a woman who wanted, for once, to be seen. They talked for hours about the lies people tell themselves to survive, about the loneliness of ambition, about the strange comfort of strangers who don't expect anything from you. He made her laugh, Real laughter that shook loose something she didn't realize she'd been holding inside for years. When she teased him about his fancy planes and corporate charm, he grinned. When she admitted she'd once dreamed of studying art in Florence, his eyes softened with admiration. At some point, she reached out to brush ash off his shoulder. The contact was fleeting, but electricity sparked through it, startling them both. Ruth drew her hand back, heartbeat skittering. "Sorry." "Don't be," he said quietly. Their eyes met. Longer this time. The air shifted. It wasn't lust that filled the space between them, it was recognition. Two broken halves, finally finding a rhythm that made sense. Outside, thunder cracked, and Ruth jumped. Arthur's hand moved instinctively to hers, their fingers tangled. Hesitant at first, then sure. She didn't pull away. The storm deepened, the world narrowing to the cabin, the fire their joined hands. Arthur's thumb brushed against her knuckles. "You're shaking." "Cold," she whispered, though it wasn't true. He shifted closer, slow and deliberate, until his breath mingled with hers. "Ruth." "Yeah?" "Tell me to stop," he said. She didn't. Their lips met, soft at first, tentative, then deeper, like exhaling after years of holding it in. Her hands framed his face, feeling the rough stubble beneath her fingers. His good arm circled her waist, drawing her closer. The kiss tasted of fire and rain, of release and quiet need. When they broke apart, Ruth rested her forehead against his. "This is crazy." "I know," he whispered, "but for once it feels like the right kind of crazy." She smiled, tears burning her eyes for reasons she couldn't explain. Outside, lightning split the sky. Inside, they let go of everything else, titles, expectations, grief, and just were. They lay together in the faint glow of the fire, bodies and hearts unwound. The storm softened into rain, a lullaby against the cabin roof. Arthur brushed his thumb along her jaw. "No one's ever looked at me the way you do," he murmured. "How's that?" "Like you see the man, not the empire." "Maybe that's all you ever were," she said softly. "A man who forgot he didn't need to build an empire to matter." He smiled faintly. "And you, Ruth Ainsley, are the only woman who's ever made me forget the noise." She curled closer, her head resting on his chest. "Then maybe that's enough for tonight." He kissed the top of her hair. "For tonight," he agreed. The fire burned low. They fell asleep, tangled together, two strangers who somehow felt like home. But morning doesn't ask permission before it breaks your heart. The first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the cabin wall. Ruth stirred at the sound of her phone buzzing from her discarded jacket. She reached for it groggily, expecting an alert from dispatch. Instead, it was a call from the hospital. Her mother's name flashed on the screen. The words from the nurse on the other end froze her blood. "Your mother collapsed last night. We've moved her to intensive care." The world shifted under her. She turned to Arthur, still asleep beside her, his face unguarded in the soft light. For a moment she let herself memorize him, the curve of his jaw, the faint crease between his brows, the warmth of his breathing. She wanted to stay. God, she wanted to stay. But her life wasn't hers to keep. Ruth rose quietly, pulling on her clothes, moving like a ghost. She found a piece of notepaper from her kit and a pen that barely worked. Her hand trembled as she wrote, "Thank you for reminding me I'm still alive." She folded the note and placed it on his jacket. Then she paused, just long enough to brush a soft kiss against his forehead. "I'm sorry," she whispered. By the time the sun rose fully, the cabin was empty. Arthur woke to silence. The space beside him was cold. The fire had died, leaving only embers and the faint scent of smoke. "Ruth!" he called. Nothing. He sat up, wincing as his bandaged arm throbbed. The note slipped from his jacket and landed at his feet. He unfolded it slowly, read the words. Once, Twice. Then he stared out the window at the thinning rain, realization dawning with the pale light of morning. She was gone, and though he didn't know it yet, the echo of that night would follow him for years, through every boardroom, every sleepless night, every hollow victory, until the day he saw her again, across a glittering ballroom floor, with two children who shared his eyes. The note burned in his hand long after the fire had gone cold. Arthur sat motionless on the edge of the cot, the sound of the storm fading into a cruel silence. The emptiness beside him was louder than thunder, heavier than the wreckage he'd crawled from. She was gone. No trace, no goodbye. Only a handful of words written in a paramedic's precise hand. "Thank you for reminding me I'm still alive." It should have been comfort. Instead, it felt like a wound. He limped to the door, scanning the misty forest beyond. The storm had broken, but the world still looked bruised. A single set of footprints led away from the cabin and vanished into the mud. "Ruth!" he shouted. His voice echoed through the trees. "Ruth!" No answer. Only the distant caw of a crow and the drip of rain from the pines. Arthur pressed a hand to his ribs, breathing through the pain, forcing his body to move. He followed the trail until it disappeared into the road, empty except for the faint tire marks of a departing ambulance. By the time rescue arrived hours later, Ruth Ainsley was already a ghost. 2 days later, Arthur Hale stepped back into the world he thought he controlled. The Hale Dynamics jet crash had made national news, headlines screaming "Billionaire survives fiery accident." Cameras flashed the moment he was discharged from the hospital. Investors wanted reassurance. The press wanted blood. His board wanted order. He wanted her. But when he asked his assistant to find a paramedic named Ruth Ainsley in Vermont, the search came up empty. No contact information. No address. Just a single report from the rescue team. A local responder transported the victim and returned home following procedure. It was as if she'd never existed. Arthur threw himself back into the machine of his empire, but it no longer fit. Every meeting, every speech, every photograph under corporate lighting felt hollow. His father's death came 3 weeks later. Heart attack. The funeral was televised. The reading of the will was worse. The old man had left Hale Dynamics in a tangle of conditions and clauses. Half the board turned on Arthur overnight. Lawsuits followed. The company bled money, and the media speculated that the crash had broken him. They weren't wrong. Arthur drank too much, slept too little, and haunted the silence of his penthouse like a man waiting for something that would never come. He read her note again and again, the paper softening under his fingers, until the words nearly disappeared. "Thank you for reminding me I'm still alive." He didn't feel alive. He felt like he'd been buried with her absence. Ruth Ainsley's world was smaller, but no less shattered. She drove through the gray dawn, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, praying she'd reach the hospital in time. Her mother survived the collapse, but barely. Months of treatment followed. Bills, paperwork, long hours at the hospital between emergency shifts. Ruth's savings vanished. Her exhaustion became a constant ache. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she thought about him. The man in the cabin, the one who'd looked at her like she was something more than the chaos around her. But that was a dream. And dreams didn't pay for ventilators. By the time she realized her period was late, she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to hope. The test strip turned pink in the small bathroom of her apartment. She stared at it for a long, unblinking minute before the first tear fell. "No," she whispered, "not now." But the universe didn't bargain. 3 weeks later, a doctor's gentle tone confirmed it. "You're pregnant, Ms. Ainsley. Around 8 weeks." Ruth sat frozen on the paper-covered table, her hands limp in her lap. The doctor kept talking, something about prenatal vitamins, support groups, follow-ups. But the words drifted past her. Her mind was somewhere else. Back in that cabin. Back to the night when the storm raged and she'd finally stopped running from herself. Arthur Hale. She barely knew him. One night, one impossible connection. And yet, every part of her knew it was him. Ruth pressed a trembling hand to her stomach. What am I supposed to do now? She tried to find him. Her first call to Hale Dynamics' main office in New York ended with an assistant who sounded startled. I'm sorry, ma'am, Mr. Hale isn't available for personal inquiries. Ruth started. I need to know if he's okay. There was an accident. I helped him. I'm aware of the incident, the voice said, curtly professional. Mr. Hale is currently out of the country for medical recovery. Do you know when he'll be back? I'm afraid I can't say. The line went dead. Ruth sat staring at her phone, the city noise outside her window fading into a distant hum. She tried again a week later, then again, until one day the operator said, Mr. Hale has stepped back from public duties indefinitely. He's not reachable at this time. The news articles told their own story. CEO Arthur Hale battles mental health crisis. Hale Dynamics faces hostile takeover. Reclusive billionaire retreats from spotlight. It was enough to make her stop calling. He had his world, she had hers, and hers was about to get a lot more complicated. By the 4th month, the nausea came and went, replaced by exhaustion so heavy she could barely stand through her shifts. But every time she thought she couldn't keep going, she felt the flutter of life beneath her ribs and found the strength to keep trying. When the ultrasound technician smiled and said, Congratulations, twins, Ruth laughed out loud. Then she cried so hard the nurse had to steady her. Two. She was having two. That night she sat in her small apartment, staring at the grainy printout of the sonogram. The shapes were small and indistinct, but they were hers. Riot and Mercy, she whispered to the air. The names had come to her instantly, unbidden. Riot for his fire, for the chaos that had brought him into her life. Mercy for the calm that followed. Her children, her miracle, her secret. The next years passed in a blur of survival. Ruth moved back to her hometown in Vermont, where rent was cheaper and life slower. She found a job at a small community hospital, working nights while her mother, her health fragile but improving, watched the twins during the day. Money was tight. The bills never stopped, but the laughter of her children made every burden bearable. Riot had Arthur's eyes, gray like a storm about to break, always curious, always daring. Mercy had his stillness, his uncanny calm, as if she carried the world's secrets in her tiny heart. Every time Ruth looked at them, she saw him. And sometimes, on the quietest nights, she wondered if he ever thought of her too. But she didn't let herself linger on the thought. Longing was a luxury she couldn't afford. In Manhattan, Arthur's empire cracked under the weight of absence. After his father's death, the board fractured. Competitors circled like sharks. Arthur became a recluse, speaking only through lawyers and advisors. For months he drifted through his penthouse as if underwater, haunted by the memory of a woman with steady hands and soft eyes who had disappeared into the rain. His therapist called it post-traumatic obsession. He called it unfinished truth. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he'd wake certain he'd heard her voice. He'd search the empty rooms, chasing echoes that never answered. He dated briefly, women who fit the part, elegant and sharp. But none of them laughed like Ruth. None of them looked at him without calculation. He built Hale Dynamics back up out of spite, then out of discipline. The company thrived again, but the man behind it faded. His assistant once found him asleep at his desk, the edges of a crumpled note pressed between his fingers. "Thank you for reminding me I'm still alive." He kept it locked in his wallet as if afraid the words would dissolve if he let go. 6 years blurred by in fragments. A kitchen table covered in crayons and cereal bowls. Ruth rushing between shifts, exhaustion softened by the sound of 2 little voices saying, "Mama." Mercy bringing her dandelions from the yard, insisting they were flowers. Riot learning to climb everything in sight, heart as wild as his name. Late nights with a paintbrush in her hand, colors blooming again after years of gray. Ruth sold a few of her paintings locally, sunsets, rivers, portraits of hands holding tiny ones. Each canvas carried pieces of her story, though no one knew it. She didn't date. Not seriously. Not because she didn't want to, but because every time someone tried to get close, she thought of a man who had made her feel alive for the first time, and then vanished like a dream at dawn. She told herself it didn't matter. Her children were her world, and yet sometimes when Riot did that crooked half-smile, or Mercy tilted her head in quiet thought, Ruth's heart clenched with something bittersweet, pride, love, and a ghost of what could have been. On the twins' 6th birthday, the sky broke open with rain, just like the night she met him. Ruth stood by the window, watching them chase each other across the living room, paper crowns askew, frosting on their cheeks. Her mother's voice came from the kitchen. "You're miles away, Ruthie," she smiled faintly. "Just thinking." "About their father?" Ruth's throat tightened. "You could say that." Her mother sighed, walking over to wrap an arm around her. "You can't live with ghosts, sweetheart." "I'm not," Ruth said softly. "I'm living for them." But when she looked outside at the rain, her reflection in the glass shimmered. Tired eyes, a faint smile, and the unmistakable ache of memory. Somewhere far away, maybe across a crowded city or another lifetime, she imagined Arthur looking out at the same storm. And maybe, for just a moment, he did. 6 years. That's how long it takes for the world to circle back. For Ruth Ainsley, 6 years meant survival, sacrifice, and love, measured in bedtime stories and paint-stained hands. For Arthur Hale, 6 years meant rebuilding his empire, burying his grief under precision and control. 2 lives moving in parallel, separated by silence and pride. Until one day an invitation arrived at Ruth's small apartment. Elegant, cream-colored, embossed with gold, the Hale Foundation Gala, honoring community arts initiatives for underprivileged children. Ruth stared at the name for a long, trembling moment. Hale. The storm that had started it all was about to return. The morning began like any other, coffee gone cold, paint smudges on the twins' breakfast napkins, and the hum of the old space heater in the corner of the studio. The community art center smelled of tempera paint and sawdust, the kind of scent that clung to hope itself. Ruth loved it here. The peeling walls, the mismatched easels, the laughter of children turning chaos into color. It was the kind of beauty she could afford. She'd built this place from scratch, brick by borrowed brick, on grant money and stubbornness. Every mural on the wall told a story of healing, of survival, of finding light after storms. Ruth was kneeling beside a boy struggling to mix blues when the mail carrier appeared in the doorway. "Morning, Miss Ainsley. Got something fancy for you today." He waved an envelope, cream-colored, heavy, elegant, the kind of paper that didn't belong in a building held together by donated nails. Ruth smiled, wiping her hands on her jeans before taking it. "Thanks. Harold." The return address froze her pulse. Hale Foundation for Global Innovation and Education. Her breath caught. Hale. She stared at the embossed gold lettering as if it might burn through her fingers. It couldn't be him. There were plenty of Hales in the world. Banks, charities, tech firms. It didn't have to mean anything, but her heart already knew better. She set the letter on the desk, unopened, trying to focus on the child's painting again, blue smeared into green. His little voice tugged her back to earth. "Ms. Ruth, is this right?" She smiled softly, forcing calm. "It's perfect, Danny. Sometimes the best colors come from mistakes." Just like her life, she thought. That evening, after the twins were asleep, Ruth sat at the kitchen table beneath the flickering light. The envelope lay in front of her, the wax seal catching the dull glow. Her hands trembled as she broke it open. "Dear Ms. Ainsley, the Hale Foundation has been following your remarkable work with the Brookhaven Children's Art Collective. Your center represents the kind of community innovation we seek to celebrate this year. We would be honored to feature your program at our annual Winter Gala in New York City. Please accept this as your formal invitation. The Hale Foundation." At the bottom, embossed beneath the signature of the foundation's board, was the name she'd tried for years not to whisper. Arthur Hale, Chairman. Her stomach turned to ice. It was him. For a long time, she didn't move. The twins' soft breathing drifted from their room, the steady rhythm grounding her. After 6 years of silence, of pretending she'd forgotten his voice, his name had found her again. Ruth closed her eyes. Why now? She almost crumpled the letter. Almost. But then she thought of the center, the broken heater, the leaking roof, the children who'd found a second home within these walls. The funding from this gala could change everything. For them. For her. For the future she'd built on her own. The next morning, Riot found her staring into her coffee mug like it held secrets. "Mama, why do you look like that?" he asked, his little brow furrowing in concern. "Like what?" she replied, forcing a smile. "Like you're about to do something scary." Mercy, still in her pajamas, climbed into Ruth's lap. "Is it because of that letter?" Ruth blinked. "You two really don't miss anything, do you?" Riot grinned. "You talk in your sleep sometimes." Her heart stuttered. "What do I say?" He shrugged. "Mostly names. But you never finish them." Ruth pressed a kiss to his temple and laughed softly. "You're too smart for your own good." That night, she told herself she was only going for the children, for the art center, for the dream she'd built from nothing. It wasn't about him. It couldn't be. But deep down, she knew the truth. Part of her needed to see him, if only to prove she'd survived without him. The week before, the gala became a whirl of motion. Mercy sat cross-legged on the floor, sketching designs while Riot held up dresses from her tiny closet like an overexcited stylist. "This one makes you look like a princess," Riot declared, holding up a faded lilac gown Ruth hadn't worn in years. Mercy wrinkled her nose. "No, that's too purple. She should wear the blue one. It makes her eyes look calm." "Calm?" Riot snorted. "Mama doesn't need calm. She needs cool." Ruth laughed so hard she nearly cried. For all their differences, her children were the perfect balance, fire and still water, just like their names. In the end, she chose the blue dress. Simple, elegant, safe. The night before the trip, she sat with her mother on the porch, the twins chasing fireflies in the yard. "You don't have to go," her mother said gently. "You've already built something beautiful here." Ruth nodded. "I know. But if this means more kids get a chance to paint, I have to." Her mother studied her face, seeing what Ruth didn't say. "And if he's there?" Ruth hesitated. "Then I'll survive it. I've done it before." The day of the gala, New York rose around her like a living memory. Glass and steel, reflections of another life. Her cab pulled up to the Hale Foundation Tower, a gleaming structure that seemed to touch the clouds. Reporters swarmed outside, cameras flashing. Ruth hesitated on the curb, the twins' faces flashing in her mind like anchors. She straightened her shoulders. She wasn't that frightened paramedic anymore. She was Ruth Ainsley, founder, mother, survivor. Inside the lobby, the air shimmered with wealth. Chandeliers like frozen constellations, marble floors polished to mirrors. Guests drifted by in gowns and tuxedos, their laughter echoing against glass walls. Ruth's heart pounded as she stepped into the elevator. She pressed the button for the 32nd floor, the grand ballroom, and watched the doors close. The hum of the elevator filled the silence. Her reflection stared back at her in the mirrored panel, calm on the surface, trembling underneath. "Just smile," she whispered to herself. "Just breathe." The elevator chimed, the doors slid open, and there he was, Arthur Hale, standing beneath a chandelier surrounded by people who bowed to his presence. He looked different, sharper somehow, the boyishness burned away by years of control. His hair was darker, his jaw set with authority, his eyes cold as winter steel. Until they found her. Then everything stopped. The room, the music, the hum of voices, all fell away. Her heart forgot how to beat. Arthur's glass slipped slightly in his hand, as if even gravity had betrayed him. He took one slow, disbelieving step forward. "Ruth." The single word cracked the air between them. And for the first time in 6 years, the storm began again. The hum of the gala was an ocean. Laughter, crystal clinking, the murmured exchange of power disguised as charm. Cameras flashed from the mezzanine balcony, where reporters documented the elite in their natural habitat. And at the center of it all stood Arthur Hale, the billionaire CEO, the man who had rebuilt an empire from ashes, the man the world revered. But in that moment, Arthur wasn't the man the cameras knew. He wasn't the controlled strategist, the polished visionary. He was a man who had just seen a ghost. Ruth Ainsley stood at the far end of the ballroom, framed by the shimmer of chandeliers and the reflection of her own disbelief. Time folded in on itself. 6 years of distance collapsed into a single impossible heartbeat. Her blue dress caught the light like calm water under moonlight. Beautiful, unassuming, devastating. And beside her, 2 small figures clung to her hands, a boy and a girl, 6, maybe 7. Arthur's eyes locked on them, gray-blue eyes, the same unmistakable shade he saw in the mirror every morning. For a second he forgot how to breathe. The MC's voice broke through his haze, polite and expectant. "Mr. Hale, your speech?" Arthur blinked, realizing he was still standing at the podium. The audience, investors, journalists, board members, waited. Cameras aimed. He looked down at the speech in his hand. The pages blurred. Words about innovation and progress seemed absurdly small now, because across the room stood the only progress that had ever mattered, and she had his eyes. Arthur's fingers tightened around the microphone. "Excuse me," he said, voice low but sharp enough to cut through the murmuring crowd. He stepped off the stage. Gasps followed as he strode across the ballroom, his composure unraveling with every step. Reporters raised cameras, heads turned like a wave rippling through the room. Ruth froze. "Arthur," she whispered, barely audible above the orchestra's faltering strings. He stopped in front of her, eyes blazing with disbelief, grief, and something darker. "6 years," he said softly. "You vanished, and now I find you." His gaze flicked to the children, raising them. The room inhaled as one. The whisper spread like fire. Hale, twins, secret. Ruth's pulse hammered in her throat. "Not here," she murmured, voice trembling. "Please, Arthur, not like this." But control had never felt further from him. "You have some explaining to do, Ruth," he said, echoing the words that would later headline every gossip column in New York. Cameras flashed. A reporter's pen scratched furiously. Ruth's hands tightened around her children's. "Arthur, they're watching." "Good." His jaw clenched. "Maybe then I'll finally get the truth." She could feel the heat of eyes, the weight of judgment. Every instinct screamed for escape. "Riot, Mercy," she whispered, voice steady only for them. "We're going outside." The twins obeyed, sensing their mother's unease. Ruth brushed past Arthur, the scent of cedar and memory clinging to him, her composure cracking like thin glass. Arthur followed. Outside, the city's winter air sliced through the tension, sharp and unforgiving. The gala's music bled faintly from the glass doors behind them. Ruth turned, fire in her voice now that the walls weren't listening. "What are you doing? You can't just cause a scene like that." "You think I care about scenes?" he snapped, voice low, ragged. "You disappeared, Ruth. No calls, no goodbye. I thought you were dead." Her lips parted, stunned by the rawness in his tone. "I looked for you," he continued, stepping closer. "Do you know what it's like to wake up in an empty cabin with nothing but a note? To spend years wondering if you ever existed at all?" Tears burned at the edges of her resolve, but she stood her ground. "And what would you have done if I'd stayed, Arthur? Fixed me? Owned me? Turned me into another project you could control?" His expression darkened. "Don't you dare make this about control." "It was about control," she shot back. "Your world chews people up. I saw it in your eyes even back then, the exhaustion, the loneliness. I wasn't going to let 2 children grow up in that." His chest rose, voice breaking. "You stole 6 years from me." Ruth's reply was a whisper, fierce and trembling. "I saved them from your world." The wind cut between them like a blade. For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the city moved. Taxi horns, footsteps, the hum of Manhattan alive and indifferent. Arthur's eyes drifted toward the glass doors, where the twins stood inside the lobby, peering out. Riot's small hand pressed against the glass. Mercy leaned against her brother's shoulder, curious, calm. Arthur's voice softened, stripped of anger. "They're mine." Ruth flinched. He took a slow step closer, eyes never leaving hers. "Aren't they?" She swallowed hard, unable to form words. He exhaled a bitter laugh. "God, I don't even need you to say it. It's like looking in a mirror." Her voice cracked. "This isn't the place for this." "Then tell me when," he said, stepping even closer. "Tell me where. Because I'm not walking away this time, Ruth. You don't get to disappear again." The promise in his tone was quiet but absolute. Steel beneath silk. Ruth turned toward the children, fighting the tremor in her hands. "We're leaving," she said softly. Arthur didn't stop her. Not this time. He stood in the cold, watching her gather Riot and Mercy, her blue dress fluttering like the last flicker of something he'd lost long ago. The car door shut. The tail lights glowed red against the wet pavement, and Arthur Hale, the man who could buy anything in the world, was left staring at the one thing he couldn't. Inside, the gala had transformed into chaos. Reporters swarmed. Whispers thick as smoke. Arthur Hale confronted an unknown woman. Twins, could they be his? Public meltdown or love story? He ignored them all. At the bar, his assistant approached cautiously. "Sir, the press is asking for a statement." Arthur's glare silenced him. He downed a glass of whiskey, the burn anchoring him back to the moment. For the first time in years, the world didn't make sense. He'd spent 6 years mastering control, rebuilding his empire, perfecting the art of detachment. And in less than 5 minutes, 1 woman and 2 small children had torn it all down. He set the glass down with quiet precision, his reflection fractured in the crystal's rim. "Find out where she lives," he said. The assistant hesitated. "Sir." Arthur's gaze lifted, cold and resolute. "Do it. I don't care how. I just need an address." He turned toward the glass wall overlooking the city. Below, car lights bled into the night like veins of fire. Somewhere out there, Ruth Ainsley was running again, but not for long. Arthur's voice dropped, barely a whisper, meant for no one but the ghosts between them. "I'll find you, Ruth. I'm not letting you disappear twice." The city felt quieter away from the glass towers and corporate shine. In a narrow, tree-lined street tucked behind an elementary school, Arthur Hale stood before a modest red-brick townhouse, humble, alive, and warm, in a way that his penthouse never was. He hesitated at the front steps. His heart, a thing long trained to obey logic and deadlines, beat unevenly. He'd found her. 3 days of sleepless searching, one discreet private investigator. One photo confirming what he already knew. Ruth Ainsley had not vanished into myth. She was here, and she had his children. Arthur exhaled slowly, pressing his hand against the iron railing. For once, he didn't know what words to prepare, what outcome to calculate. He knocked. The sound barely echoed before small footsteps pattered across wood floors. The door creaked open, and a pair of eyes stared up at him, gray-blue, the exact shade that haunted him in the mirror every morning. The boy spoke first, chin tilted up with cautious bravery. "Mom doesn't let us talk to strangers." Arthur's throat tightened. "That's good advice." The girl peeked out from behind her brother, curls tumbling over her cheeks. "Are you here for the art class?" Arthur smiled faintly despite the ache in his chest. "No. I'm here to see your mother." Riot frowned, assessing him with the protective instinct of someone far older than 6. "You look like me." The words hit harder than any blow could have. Before Arthur could respond, a familiar voice floated from deeper inside the house. "Riot, Mercy, who's at the door?" Ruth stepped into view, wiping paint from her hands with a worn cloth. The moment her eyes met his, the color drained from her face. Time didn't slow this time. It simply stopped. "Arthur," she breathed. He didn't move. "You weren't going to tell me." The children looked between them, confusion shadowing their small faces. Ruth knelt gently, voice soft. "Sweethearts, why don't you go finish your drawings in the living room?" Riot hesitated. "Mom, it's okay," she said, brushing his hair back. "Go on. Please." When the children disappeared down the hallway, the silence that followed was heavy and fragile. Ruth leaned against the doorframe, shoulders tense. "You shouldn't be here." Arthur stepped inside anyway, his voice low. "I didn't come for an argument." Her laugh was brittle. "That's funny. You've always seemed good at those." He glanced around. The house smelled faintly of turpentine and cinnamon. Paintings lined the walls, wild, emotional pieces filled with color and longing, a far cry from the sterile perfection of his world. "This is how you've been living," he murmured. "No press, no bodyguards, just—" His gaze softened. "Life." Ruth crossed her arms, "Exactly the way I wanted it." Arthur nodded once, his jaw tight. "Tell me everything, Ruth. I deserve to know." She hesitated, then sighed. "You do." They sat at the small kitchen table, sunlight streaming through sheer curtains. Between them, the air pulsed with 6 years of unsaid words. Ruth's voice was quiet, steady. "After the night in the cabin, my mother collapsed. I had to leave before dawn. I tried to call your company later, multiple times, but they said you were unavailable." Arthur's eyes narrowed. "Unavailable?" "They told me you were in Europe, that you'd stepped down after a breakdown." He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "I wasn't in Europe. I was in a rehab facility. My leg was shattered from the crash. They didn't want the press knowing the great Arthur Hale couldn't walk without help." Ruth looked down, guilt clouding her face. "I thought you'd moved on, or worse, that you didn't even remember me." His voice cracked. "I remembered everything. The sound of the rain, the way you held the flashlight steady while my blood soaked your hands, the letter you left. I read it 100 times. Tears glimmered at the corners of her eyes. I didn't want to disappear, Arthur. I just didn't see a place for myself in your world. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression breaking into something raw and human. You were my world for that one night, Ruth. Everything else felt like noise. The quiet stretched, deep and aching. Ruth swallowed hard. A few weeks later, I found out I was pregnant. Twins. Arthur inhaled sharply, as if the air itself betrayed him. I thought about calling again, she continued softly. But you were everywhere, on news covers, in interviews, and when I saw the rumors about your breakdown, I decided I couldn't add to your burden. I was terrified. My mom's health got worse, the bills piled up, and I just focused on surviving. Her hands trembled slightly on the table. I told myself if you ever wanted to find me, you would, but you didn't. Arthur closed his eyes, jaw tight. I tried, Ruth. God, I tried. The crash took months to recover from, and when I was finally strong enough to look for you, all I had was your first name and a note. No address, no number, nothing. Her breath hitched. So we both thought the other was gone. He nodded slowly. Fate's cruel like that. A long silence followed. The clock ticked softly on the counter. Then Arthur's voice cracked through the quiet, low and hoarse. All these years, I built an empire. I rebuilt my company, my reputation, everything they said I'd lost. He looked up at her, eyes shining with something heartbreakingly real. But what I wanted was this. Ruth's throat closed. Arthur. I could have lived without the headlines, without the power, but not knowing. His voice faltered. Not knowing I had them, that I had you. That's what nearly destroyed me. A tear slipped down Ruth's cheek before she could stop it. He rose slowly from the chair, standing in the small space between them. The distance that had once felt infinite was now a breath away. Arthur reached out but didn't touch her. They're beautiful, Ruth. Both of them. You did this alone? She nodded. They've never wanted for love. I can see that. His voice softened to a whisper. You made a home, something I never had. The edges of her resolve began to crumble. Don't make this harder than it already is. I'm not here to take anything from you, he said. I just want to know them. To earn the right to be part of their lives. If you'll let me. Ruth met his eyes. The anger that had burned between them for so long seemed to dissolve into something gentler, something like forgiveness. You don't have to earn it, she said quietly. You just have to show up. He let out a shaky breath that sounded like a confession. I can do that. For a long moment they stood in the golden afternoon light, two people stripped of pride, history, and everything that had kept them apart. From the hallway came the sound of laughter, Riot's bold, unrestrained, and Mercy's soft giggle trailing after him. Ruth turned toward the sound, smiling faintly through tears. They'll want to show you their paintings. Arthur's voice wavered. I'd like that. As he followed her toward the living room, he paused in the doorway. Watching the twins sprawled on the floor, their crayons scattered in a burst of color. Riot looked up, grinning. Mom says we can show you our drawings. Arthur crouched beside them, his polished world slipping away. I'd love to see them. Mercy tilted her head, studying him. Are you going to stay? Arthur met Ruth's gaze. The answer came softly, but with the weight of a promise. Yes, he said. I'm staying. And for the first time in years, Arthur Hale didn't feel like the man who'd conquered the world. He felt like the man who'd finally found home. The forest hadn't changed. The trees still stood tall and solemn, their branches heavy with snow. The air still carried that clean, sharp scent of pine and memory. But to Arthur Hale, it felt entirely new. He stood beside the black SUV parked at the trailhead, watching as Ruth stepped out, her breath curling in the crisp air. Riot and Mercy followed, bundled in matching coats, their laughter echoing across the quiet clearing. Ruth turned to him, eyebrows lifted. "So this is where it happened." Arthur smiled faintly, the ghost of that night flickering behind his eyes. "Right here. The crash site was about half a mile east. The old ranger cabin was a little further uphill." Riot craned his neck to look at him. "The one Mom found you in?" Arthur nodded. "That's the one." Mercy's mittened hand slipped into her mother's. "Is it still there?" Arthur's expression softened. "Why don't we find out?" The hike was quiet, broken only by the crunch of snow and the twins' chatter. Ruth walked beside Arthur, their shoulders brushing now and then, each contact charged but easy, like something rediscovered, not new. "Why bring us here?" she asked quietly. Arthur hesitated. "Because this is where everything began, where I almost lost my life, and somehow found the only thing that ever mattered." Ruth's gaze lingered on him. "Arthur!" "Don't," he said softly, almost pleading. "Just wait until you see it." When the cabin came into view, Ruth stopped in her tracks. It was the same shape she remembered, the sturdy log walls, the stone chimney, but now rebuilt, restored. The roof was new, smoke already curling from the chimney. Warm light spilled from the windows, painting the snow gold. "You rebuilt it?" she whispered. Arthur nodded. "Took some convincing. The ranger station still owned the land, but I offered to fund the whole restoration project, as long as they let me keep this one cabin." Riot sprinted forward, his boots kicking up snow. "This is so cool." Mercy twirled in a slow circle, catching snowflakes on her gloves. "It's like a fairy tale," Ruth laughed softly. "They're right, it's beautiful." Arthur looked at her, his breath visible in the cold air. "It's not just a cabin anymore. It's a place to start over, for all of us." Inside, the warmth hit them like an embrace. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing light across the wooden walls. The air smelled faintly of cedar and pine. On a small table sat mugs, a thermos, and a vase of winter flowers. Ruth turned slowly, taking it all in. Her eyes landed on a framed photo on the mantel, a photograph of the forest captured at sunrise. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "To the woman who saved me and the life I didn't know I was missing." Her hand trembled slightly as she touched the frame. "Arthur," he shrugged, his voice low. "It seemed fitting." Riot and Mercy had already discovered a loft ladder and were climbing it like explorers. Their laughter filled the cabin, the sound of pure life. Ruth smiled faintly. "They're going to love this place. That's the point," he said. When she turned to look at him again, there was something vulnerable in his eyes, an openness that hadn't been there before. "I don't want to buy their love," he said quietly, "or yours. I don't want to be the man who shows up with gifts and apologies. I want to earn it, every day, the way you earned everything you have." Her lips parted, surprise softening into something warmer. "You don't need to earn anything, Arthur." He took a step closer. "I do, because I spent too many years trying to prove I was enough for everyone else. My father, the board, the world, and somewhere along the way I forgot what it felt like to be enough for someone who actually mattered." Ruth looked at him for a long moment, snowlight catching in her eyes. Then she shook her head gently. "We don't need a billionaire, Arthur." He smiled faintly, a shadow of humility threading through it. She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need a man who stays." The words hit him deeper than he expected, like an anchor dropped straight into the storm of his life. He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. their fingers intertwined, warm against the chill. Outside, Riot's voice carried from the loft. "Mom." "Arthur, come see. There's a window up here that looks out over everything." Arthur chuckled, his voice soft. "Sounds like an invitation." Ruth squeezed his hand once before calling back, "We're coming, sweetheart." They climbed the narrow ladder and stepped into the loft. The twins had claimed a cozy corner by the window, their cheeks pink from excitement. The glass looked out over the valley, the last blush of daylight fading behind the snow-dusted trees. Mercy pointed. "Look, it's like the whole world is sleeping." Ruth knelt beside her, smiling. "Maybe it's just resting. Even the world needs a break sometimes." Arthur stood behind them, watching the scene unfold with quiet awe. It was so ordinary, and yet to him it felt sacred. Ruth turned her head slightly, catching his gaze. "What are you thinking?" He hesitated, searching for the words. "That I used to believe happiness was something you built, something you controlled or conquered. And now," he smiled faintly, "now I think it's something you find, usually when you're not looking." Ruth's heart ached at the softness in his tone. "You found it," she said quietly. He nodded. "I found you." The twins, oblivious to the depth of their parents' moment, pressed their faces to the window, watching snow begin to fall in lazy spirals. "Can we stay here tonight?" Riot asked eagerly. Ruth hesitated, looking at Arthur. He nodded without hesitation. "We'll light the fireplace, make hot chocolate, and tell ghost stories if we have to." Mercy clapped her hands. "Best trip ever." Ruth laughed, and the sound felt like the world coming full circle. Later that night, after the twins had fallen asleep in the loft, Riot snoring softly, Mercy curled under a blanket. Ruth and Arthur sat by the fire. The crackle of wood filled the silence between them. Arthur stared into the flames. "I used to think the crash was the worst thing that ever happened to me. Losing control like that, it broke something in me." Ruth looked at him, eyes gentle. "Maybe it broke the part that needed breaking." He smiled faintly. "Maybe." Her gaze softened. "You're different now." "I had to be," he admitted. "I couldn't live another day being the man who let you slip away." She reached out, brushing a stray ember of ash from his sleeve. "You didn't let me slip away, Arthur. Life did. But maybe it brought us back for a reason." The firelight flickered against his face, and for the first time he looked utterly at peace. Outside, the snow deepened. Inside, warmth pulsed between them, gentle, quiet, real. Ruth leaned her head against his shoulder. He exhaled, a sound half relief, half wonder. For a while, neither spoke. They didn't need to. Then, softly, Ruth whispered, "Do you ever think about that night?" Arthur's arm tightened around her. "Every day, not because of what we lost, but because it's what led me here." She smiled against his shoulder. "To us." "To home," he murmured. In the morning, the world was silver with new snow. The twins' laughter rang through the forest as they tumbled outside, building uneven snowmen. Ruth and Arthur stood at the cabin doorway, watching. Riot tugged Arthur's hand toward the snowfield, demanding help with his fort. Mercy slipped her smaller hand into Ruth's. Ruth met Arthur's gaze, her heart full. He smiled, the rare kind that didn't belong to a billionaire or a CEO, but to a man who'd finally learned what mattered. Together, they stepped out into the snow. The family of four walked toward the cabin's glowing light, their footprints weaving into one trail behind them. And as the sky brightened with the first blush of dawn, Arthur's voice broke the quiet, soft, certain, reverent. "She vanished after one night, but when I found her again, I finally found myself." Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting and even more intriguing than you can ever imagine. So do check it out, and remember to subscribe